All the financial titans and philanthropists of the 20th century, none are more complex or mysterious than George Soros. Like Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and the Rockefellers, he amassed billions through ruthless business decisions, only to turn around and give away most of his fortune to advance his own personal philosophy. He can move world financial markets simply by voicing an opinion, or destabilize a government by buying and selling its currency. He also pledged more aid last year to help people in Russia than the U.S. government did. But now George Soros is worried. He thinks the global economy is coming apart at the seams and that the world needs to be protected from people like George Soros.
We may now think that everything is fine, but the fact is that the system is broke and it needs fixing.
What you're doing is asking some form of regulation to protect the world against you.
Well, I am a player, and I think all players should be regulated. There have to be rules of the game.
548,000. Buy him 69,000 YUM.
Right now, his Quantum Group hedge fund moves $14 billion of rich investors' money around the world every day, looking for profits and answering to no one. Soros makes huge bets on whole countries and economies. Last year, when he saw cracks in the Asia boom, he began selling the currency in Thailand. Traders in Hong Kong followed suit, triggering a financial crisis that plunged much of Asia into a depression.
In the last 2 years, you've been blamed for financial collapse of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, and Russia.
Yeah, all of the above.
All of the above.
Yeah.
Are you that powerful?
No, I think there's a great misunderstanding.
The Prime Minister of Malaysia said that the region spent 40 years trying to build up its economy, and along comes a moron like Soros with a lot of money, and it's all over. He called you a criminal.
It's easier for him to blame an outside force than to admit that they were mismanaging their economy and their currency. The French finance minister talked about hanging speculators from lampposts.
Soros says the Asian currencies would have collapsed even if he hadn't been in the market. They were overvalued. He says people tend to follow his lead because he's been so successful.
I think that I've been blamed for everything. I am basically there to make money. I cannot and do not look at the social consequences of what I do.
To understand the complexities and contradictions in his personality, you have to go back to the very beginning, to Budapest, where George Soros was born 68 years ago to parents who were wealthy, well-educated, and Jewish. When the Nazis occupied Budapest in 1944, George Soros' father was a successful lawyer. He lived on an island in the Danube and liked to commute to work in a rowboat. But knowing there were problems ahead for the Jews, he decided to split his family up. He bought them forged papers, and he bribed a government official to take 14-year-old George Soros in and swear that he was his Christian godson. But survival carried a heavy price tag. While hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews were being shipped off to the death camps, George Soros accompanied his phony godfather on his appointed rounds, confiscating property from the Jews. These are pictures from 1944 of what happened to George Soros' friends and neighbors.
You're a Hungarian Jew who escaped the Holocaust by posing as a Christian.
Right.
And you watched lots of people get shipped off to the death camps.
Right. I was 14 years old. And I would say that that's when my character was made.
In what way?
That one should think ahead, one should understand and anticipate events, and one is threatened. It was a tremendous threat of evil. I mean, it was a very personal experience of evil.
My understanding is that you went out with this protector of yours who swore that you were his adopted godson.
Yes, yes.
Went out, in fact, and helped in the confiscation of property from the Jews.
That's right. Yes.
I mean, that sounds like an experience that would send lots of people to the psychiatric couch for many, many years. Was it difficult?
Not at all. Not at all. Maybe as a child you don't see the connection, but it created no No problem at all.
No feeling of guilt.
No.
For example, that I'm Jewish and here I am watching these people go, I could just as easily be there. I should be there. None of that.
Well, of course, I could be on the other side, or I could be the one from whom the thing is being taken away. But there was no sense that I shouldn't be there, because that was, well, actually, funny way, it's just like in markets, that if I weren't there, of course I wasn't doing it, but somebody else would be taking it away anyhow. In other words, whether I was there or not, I was only a spectator, the property was being taken away. So I had no role in taking away that property. So I had no sense of guilt.
Are you religious?
No.
Do you believe in God?
No. It was actually probably the happiest year of my life, that year of German occupation. For me, it was a very positive experience. It's a strange thing, you know, because you see incredible suffering around you, and in fact, you're in considerable danger yourself. But you're 14 years old and you don't believe that it can actually touch you. You have a belief in yourself, your belief in your father. It's a very happy-making, exhilarating...
George Soros has now been officially banned from 6 different nations. As we're seeing Soros's fingerprints around the so-called whistleblowers complaint that references Soros-funded organizations several times in its dossier, or his fingerprints behind the chaos going on in the British Parliament in the hopes of sabotaging Brexit with his funding of a Remainer organization called Best for Britain, even with his fingerprints in proximity to 16-year-old environmentalist Greta, how dare you, Thunberg, in terms of her guide who works for a Soros-funded organization. I thought this would be a wonderful opportunity for us to sit back and count the number of nations that have formally and officially banned George Soros and his open society from their borders. And we're going to find out why we can expect that number to continue to rise. Now, 6 nations that have officially banned George Soros from their borders. And what I want to do is I want to go in reverse order from the latest one that banned him, and that would be the Philippines, okay? I don't know if you've been familiar with what's going on in the Philippines of late, but they really are part of this mass shift to the nationalist populist right. Their president, of course, is Rodrigo Duterte, and a number of articles, even a major academic book, have been written on the rise of the nationalist populism in the Philippines as embodied by the Duterte presidency. And I know that for those of us on this channel, all we need to know about Duterte's populist bona fides is that he has as one of his chief enemies the ultra-notorious George Soros. And for a number of reasons, Duterte blames Soros for crashing the Southeast economy through his ruthless currency speculation. And Duterte has also been merciless in his crackdown on drug trafficking in the Philippines, which goes against Soros's global attempts to legalize drugs. Now, a few months back, Soros was planning on visiting the Philippines, or what he was calling a humanitarian visit, whatever that means. But upon hearing of it, Duterte publicly warned Soros that if he steps foot in his country, then there'll be a bounty on his head. And what makes his warning extra ominous is that the Philippine House of Representatives approved a proposal a couple of weeks prior to that to reinstate the death penalty. So in light of that, Duterte went a step further and he said, you know, there's a special place in hell for you, you idiot, George Soros. And you step 1 foot in this country and I'll be happy to take you straight there. All right, that was Duterte. Soros is not welcome in the Philippines. Now, the Philippines banning was, of course, on the heels of Soros getting kicked out of Hungary. Back in December 2018, Soros's Open Society Foundations announced that it had become impossible to work in what they called the repressive atmosphere of Hungary, and that they were picking up and moving their operations to Berlin. Now, this was in response to the massive landslide win of Viktor Orban, who's become the mortal enemy of Soros. And at the heart of his campaign, Orban promoted what's commonly referred to as the Stop Soros Law, which penalizes NGOs, non-governmental agencies, that seek to undermine Hungary's border security in a number of ways and in effect flood the nation with immigrants, refugees. What such a law mandates is that these NGOs would be required to obtain national security clearance, and if they've been funded by an outside source, a source outside of the borders of Hungary, like George Soros's money here in the United States, then they would be required to pay a 25% tax on those contributions, which is, of course, more than most NGOs can bear. So Orban just doesn't play around. Hungary's going to secure its borders, and if you're actively attempting to thwart that, then you're going to face some pretty stiff penalties. And the interesting thing here is you could still do it. No one's technically stopping you from trying to open up the borders to mass immigration. But if you do, then you're going to have to suffer the consequences of countermeasures to secure the border, okay? And so, as a result of Orban's landslide win, roughly 100 employees of George Soros' foundation started packing up their offices, and it looks like they are gone for good as far as Hungary is concerned. And then, right around the same time, Soros and his Open Society foundations were banned from Russia. Russia passed a law that no longer permitted Soros to fund organizations operating within its borders. The Open Society Foundation were considered a threat to the foundations of the Russian constitutional system and the security of the state, which includes the notion, interestingly enough, of what the Russians call spiritual security. Now, we've talked about this in other videos, and I found Julie Elkner's research in this area very, very helpful. Spiritual security is considered a subset of national security, and a number of policy documents issued by the Putin government. Spiritual security is designed as a primary measure by which traditional Russian values, embodied particularly by the Russian Orthodox Church, can be protected and perpetuated in the midst of globalized assaults, like what we're seeing from Soros and the Open Society Foundations. So since the year 2000, Russian statesmen have concluded that the assurance of the Russian Federation's national security included protecting the nation's cultural, spiritual, and moral legacy in the historical traditions and standards of public life. So there has to be a state policy that maintains the population's spiritual and moral welfare, as well as counter the adverse impact of any organization seeking to undermine that spiritual and moral welfare. And so George Soros's active attempt at liberalizing societies, destroying the centrality of their religions, their cultures, their traditional foundations, that was considered a threat to the national security of Russia, and he and his organizations were effectively banned. Now, as if that wasn't bad enough, just before he was kicked out of Hungary and Russia, Soros's Open Society announced that it was packing up and moving permanently out of Turkey. And this is because of the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He's made Soros and the Open Society Foundation a target in his effort to unite the nation around his vision of a traditionalist conservatism, in this case, Islamic conservatism, of course. Erdogan has accused Soros of stoking up division and protests in Turkey, particularly in what's called the Gezi Park protests back in 2013. It sparked some of the biggest political challenges to Erdogan's 15-year rule. And so the question, of course, was who was financing these mass protests and demonstrations? And Erdogan didn't have to look far until he found Soros's fingerprints. And so Erdogan has banished Soros from Turkey. Now, prior to that, in November of 2018, before Soros was kicked out of Turkey, in August of 2018, the nation of Poland deported a top Soros operative. I believe the charge was an abuse of what's called the Schengen Information System. And this operative was considered a threat to national security and public order by Polish officials. And so the Nationalist Populist Law and Justice Party ended up kicking her out, and as a result, Soros's organization as a whole out of Poland. The year before that, back in 2017, Pakistan had ordered George Soros's foundation to close their doors and leave the country. They didn't give really any explanation. The Open Society Foundation was basically forced to pack their bags and leave Pakistan on the basis that Soros's registration application had been denied. So they just got kicked out of Pakistan. So all told, George Soros has now been expelled from 6 different nations, from the Philippines, Hungary, Russia, Poland, Turkey, and Pakistan, which of course, nation, culture, custom, and tradition is the basis for a sustainable social order. The ultra-liberal globalist vision of Soros would not only appear more and more implausible and futile, it will actually begin to be seen more and more as a threat, a very real threat to the unity